slide you're looking at right now is the only slide we're going to have tonight. We have been, as I've excused myself so many times and whined and begged, just awfully busy, particularly in the last 2 months with the remodel. So my brother being here kept us especially busy. I took him to the airport this morning. He's off to California for about a week to be with my mom and then heading home to Sedona, Arizona, where I'll probably join him in about a week. So I've got some traveling that's coming up, but really just couldn't find the time to try to put some slides together. When I thought about it, though, I recognized also that I was kind of hesitant and reluctant to want to put some slides together. We're going to be doing a lot of reading tonight, or longer sections tonight, which are difficult to put on a slide anyway. So get your Bibles open. We're going to be looking into chapter 14, try to cover all the 20 verses of this 14th chapter here this evening. And then if all goes well, the pace will pick up just a little bit in the upcoming weeks. This chapter tonight is really not very difficult at all, so kind of an easy night, if you will. Chapters 15 and 16, I will try to put together and take in one class next week. And likewise with chapters 17 and 18. While they are longer, it's a lot of verses to cover in 17 and 18. It's usually quite easy to do that. In fact, I think every time I've succeeded in working with both those chapters because they do go together. So look for that. Chapter 14 tonight, 15 and 16 next week, 17 and 18 the week after that. Well, wow, the book's only got 22 chapters. We're getting down through this thing now. So welcome aboard. Thank you for being so very faithful. I appreciate quite a sizable number of you, a surprising number, that have been so very determined to stick with this, go to a deeper level than we typically do in Revelation, and certainly looking at much wider array of passages from the Old Testament and the New. You have proven yourselves to be Bereans and truth seekers and certainly diligent in your studies. All the feedback I've gotten has just been most commendable for your sake. To God be the glory, and he's been much glorified, I think, in all of your efforts. So let's take on chapter 14. As you know, I want to do, I'm going to read the entire chapter before we get into any commentary. I've marked all the chapters, again, as you know well. This one takes about 3.5 minutes to read. So in about 4 minutes, we'll have a look at the passages themselves. Chapter 14 of Revelation follows on the heels of the beginning of this second section of the book, almost really a volume 2 of Revelation. We've had our introduction to the woman, to the child, to the dragon, which is Satan himself, to the beast out of the sea and the beast out of the earth, and then the man whose number is his name. And in all of these things, we have seen behind the scenes, under the control of our God, but still being worked through the very corrupt and evil hands, first of the Satan who sought to kill the child of Israel, the child of God's chosen people, Jesus, with his murder of the infants in Bethlehem. He fails. The woman representing faithful Israel is eventually, as Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24, forced to flee when the abomination of desolation, which is Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman armies, appears. The faithful saints, now Christians, have fled off into the east and slightly north of Jerusalem. We've seen a sea beast, which represents Rome by virtually everyone's understanding. That one's just very clear. The earth beast, which represents false religion that is closely allied with Rome. So tempting as it is to see the Jewish false prophets in more of a singular and focused sense, they may well be Jewish false prophets. We looked at several of them last week, but they were throwing their weight in favor of Rome against Christ, but also serving Satan's purposes with the Roman Empire. And so it's more likely, I think, though only slightly more likely perhaps, that it represents the idolatrous Roman practices, the pinch of salt on the altar to the Roman emperors, rather than something that would have been inherently Jewish. But this is one of those several occasions in the book where I think we have even more abundant evidence to the fact that these prophecies are speaking of actual physical events which took place, most of them in the near-term future. But as the book told us in the very first chapter, speaking of some things that were past and some things that would be farther future, one of which we're going to be seeing here tonight. So, with chapters 12 and 13 behind us and these particularly prodigious, important characters that are introduced under these figures representing actual events that took place in world history, we have now chapter 14 and verse 1. And I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. And the voice which I heard was like of harpists playing on their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne, and before the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. These are the ones who have not been defiled with women, for they have kept themselves chaste. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. And no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. And he said with a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and springs of waters." And another angel, a second one, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her fornication." And another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest, day and night, those who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name." Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow after them." Follow with them, pardon me. "And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud, one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe.' And he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. And the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues. And so we see this constantly, continuously unfolding revelation. One vision after another, one angel after another. And each of these amazing scenes, of course, are loud and must have been terrifying, and yet beautiful in their loudness. It can be like the voice of harps somehow. And so you have this wondrous mixture of just overwhelming sights and sounds that John, shall I say, has to endure. It's already knocked him out once. This man is having an experience that's just unparalleled in human experience. As say, Paul being caught up, I suppose. There's just nothing like it for a human being to experience like this. We think of Moses on the mountain. It had certainly similar elements like that, but exceptionally rare event. These visions, of course, are just that. They are signs. They are identified as that in the very first verses. They are symbols that represent other things. Some of these statements will have very literal fulfillments. I think the 42 months, the 1260 days, a time times and half a time means precisely that, as human beings keep time. Others of these things are designed to show the fullness of some given event that takes place. They represent things that take place in space and time, but they don't necessarily each and every time have precise exactitude, as we'll see, for instance, when it comes to the blood up to horses' bridles and 200 miles. So let's go back now and just have a look bit by bit, especially tonight. You want to keep your syllabus beside you. This is the whole of the presentation really this evening, and I do very much want you to get out a pencil or a pen. I noted as I was working through this material, I made a mistake in one of the references. In fact, I do this so often I forget to come back to it later. Let's get that out of the way. Please open to page 48 in the syllabus. Now, if you have the big one, it'd be page 48. And that, of course, is on chapter 14. And then just a little bit past the halfway mark, the last line in the section for chapter 14, verses 9 through 12, so right above the underlined line for 14:13, that last statement has a whole string of verses, all of which I hope to get to this evening. And we have Isaiah 1, verse 31, as well as Isaiah 66, verse 24, then Jeremiah 7:20, and it's that next one in Jeremiah that's incorrect. I've got 17:21, probably misread my handwritten notes years ago. That should be 17:27. It's 6 verses later, so you want to correct that, and I certainly will for future publications here, but it should be chapter 17 and verse 27 there. And then the Ezekiel and Matthew and Jude passages are okay, they're accurate. So what do we have? Well, right off the bat, we have the Lamb. The Lamb has appeared before, and the Lamb, as I show in my notes, that second line there, actually occurs 26 times. We've got this Lamb mentioned here in this book, and except for the lying one from last week's material, chapter 13 and 11, we have every one of these certainly representing Jesus. Jesus is the sacrificial lamb, worthy because of his triumph and sacrifice and resurrection to open up the 7 seals, and therefore this entire book of Revelation. We see the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. This, of course, is the mountain in Jerusalem upon which the old temple stood. And to this day, that temple mount is readily recognizable. We know very precisely where that temple used to stand, though the Romans scraped it flat and bare. And then we have the 144,000, and they were first seen in chapter 7. Let's read that material. Back in chapter 7 at verse 2, I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God. And he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads." So this idea of God's marking individuals that belong to him with some special insignia of his own design and application, but recognizing those that belong to God as those as opposed to those who don't, is a repetitive idea, concept that keeps popping up. And we certainly saw it last week. Again, we had people being marked, only these now are not the faithful saints, but those unfaithful Jews who would not accept their Messiah. Now, these 144,000 in verse 4, the number that are sealed, are from every tribe of the sons of Israel. So the 144,000, you'll remember, specifically and exclusively is referring to Jews who were the first to come to Christ there in the first century. The Gentiles who would be coming to Christ are also, though, in chapter 7, beginning at verse 9. After these things I looked, excuse me, I lost my voice there. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes and palm branches in their hands, and they cry out with a loud voice, saying, "Salvation to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne, the elders and the 4 living creatures. We've been seeing them some chapters 4 and 5. Fell on their faces before the throne, worshiped God, saying, "Amen. Blessing, glory, wisdom, thanksgiving, honor, power, and might to our God forever and ever. Amen." And one of the elders answered, saying to me, "These who are clothed in the white robes, who are they, and from where have they come?" And I said to him, "My Lord, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation." Yes, the great tribulation Jesus spoke of in Matthew chapter 24, of course. "And they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they're before the throne." So we have both the Jews and the Gentiles identified by a seal, a numbering, a clothing. They are being singled out with various identifying marks that are symbols of God's ownership. Well, now we're back to chapter 14, and we have these 144,000 in the first verse. His name and the name of his father written on their foreheads. There's the seal again. And in verse 2, I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder, the voice which I heard like harpists playing on their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who'd been purchased from the earth. They're the same people. It's the same setting. We still have chapters 4 and 5 and all of those that were gathered before and around about the throne. We still have the Lamb there upon that throne. And so, while chapter 12 backs up the start even prior to the birth of Jesus the Christ, so certainly not things that were shortly to come to pass, but it had already taken place some 65 years ago, this second half has not forgotten that we are speaking of events that have to do with a particular judgment in which the wrath of God is going to be poured out in a most spectacularly terrifying, appalling manner. You certainly don't want to be on the receiving end of it. But those Jews who first came to Christ are spared. And the Gentiles who had come to Christ, of course, would either not have been in Jerusalem as Paul's work has been going on, or certainly would have followed the Jews out of town there when the time came that the gospel had been preached in all the oikumene. If I'm pronouncing that right, I think I'm forgetting it again. But it's the Roman Empire. So they sing a song that is exclusive to them, and all of this is about being recognized in the presence of God as having triumphed in every manner, being exactly what God would have you be. And then you will see, purchased from the earth, so bought with the blood of Christ, verse 4, these are the ones who have not been defiled with women, for they've kept themselves chaste, which is a terrible translation. I love the New American Standard. I really love the New King James as well, the English Standard Version. There's good translations out there. My favorite still remains stubbornly the New American Standard. But that chaste is just not the idea. The word there is the word virgin. It is virgin. You can be chaste without being a virgin. And so you need to write that in the margin there to get the fullness and the actual specificity of what it is that appeared in the vision before John's eyes and ears. So they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. So whether we take the 144,000 to just be a nice round full number that represents not a literal, precise, exclusively, not one more or less, 144,000, or we take it as being exactly 144,000 to the person, which it could be. It could go either way on that, which it could be. Either way, brethren, they are identified for us toward the end of verse 4 as the first fruits. These are not the last people to come to Christ. These are not Christ people in our generation and time. We are still rooted very tightly to the first century events in a reward for those people who have suffered through the Great Tribulation, for the people who had the toughest time, who saw their Lord murdered, who themselves were persecuted by those Jews for the next 40 years, who suffered so horribly there in that first century. It must have been grand and great and glorious to live in those days from one sense, but I think overpowering all of it is the price that was paid for that privilege. You probably would not have wanted to live in those days, even if you could sit on the hill and listen to Jesus preach that sermon. It got bad for 4 decades after that. So these people are being described as not defiled with women, virgins who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, purchased from among men as the first fruits of God and to the Lamb, and no lie was found in their mouth, for they are blameless. So, I don't know which way to go on this. I don't think I have enough information to say, well, it's 144,000, no more or less. And it's only men, no women. What it is to give us an idea of who the first fruits were and how they are everything God wants. With each and every description there, you get a picture of purity, of not having been involved in the things of the world, as kept themselves reserved for the service of their God. And in terms of a figure, I think that Old Testament, those familiar with the Old Testament would really appreciate. If you're a Jew, you recognize the special cleansings that the priests went through under the old law. You recognize it to be one of those who had this close relationship with God and could act as a mediator between God and men. These individuals, the priests, and of course we're all priests today, we're told as Christians, they had to always keep themselves back and away and separate from all the normal activities, well, not all, but many of the normal activities in life. So it's just a similar way of showing the people of God now under the New Testament and their faithfulness to their King. Now please note verse 6. I saw another angel flying amid heaven, having what? An eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. Brethren, this is now a passage, verse 6, that will be stretching out beyond the fall of Jerusalem. We cannot, must not limit that verse to things that were shortly to come to pass and then must necessarily stop and be fulfilled. This is the gospel being preached all the way down to this day, and it's still being preached to this day. So for the third or fourth or fifth time, whatever it is, I just want to say that it's easy to misunderstand Revelation. Honest-hearted people, do. I did for a long time, and I think I had an honest heart the whole way. But there are three different types of materials in this book, and those, commonly referred to as covenant eschatologists or realized eschatologists, a fairly brand new kind of religious approach to things, that rewriting the definition of resurrection to exclude bodies coming out of the tomb. So many of them are just so very confident that there's not one word in the book of Revelation that remains to be fulfilled. I've had some really in my face and on my case that way. Well, look at this. 14:6. Just a start, for tonight, and we'll see more to come, is not an event that's over. And it was not speaking of an event that had to cease shortly. It was already taking place. It had been going on. It is taking place. And it will be going on. It's a picture of the success of the gospel throughout the ages while there are still people living on the earth in nations, tribes, tongues, and people. Those people are receiving the gospel. But at this time in verse 7, he says to those of that time and place, he says in verse 7, fear God, give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of waters. This is critically important, brethren, because this gospel is an eternal gospel, and it's going to be going forward. It still is. People are still living on the earth, tribes and tongues and peoples and nations. But the judgment hour was upon those first fruits at that time. And when this judgment is over, that is soon to come to pass, it's the judgment that's near, that wrath that's going to fall upon these Jews who would not accept Jesus. That was what's near in the book of Revelation, and is going to be particularly prominent starting tonight through the next handful of chapters, in which we will be now embarking upon what I think the absolutely most convincing parts of the book to nail down that in the book of Revelation, what was soon to come to pass was the 3.5-year siege by the Romans on the land and the city, culminating in the fall of the temple itself. So look at 6 and 7. Obviously, that's what he's saying. The wrath of God is about to fall. There's delay no longer, chapters 10 and 11. And so we're looking at that same thing again from a different standpoint, starting in chapter 12, beginning earlier and prior to the birth of Christ and passing on even to our time while the gospel in these two verses is still being preached. But at the moment Revelation is written, the judgment that's soon to come to pass, which is the great bulk of this book, will take place. And that eternal gospel will be preached throughout those 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, and all the way on after that. Here it comes. In verse 8, the start of a new theme. And you want to make a note in the margin of your Bible here. This is the first mention of Babylon in the book of Revelation. In verse 8, another angel, a second one, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her fornication. So if you got a wide margin Bible like I do, I'll read to you, the whole thing I wrote in my margin, but what I've got next to verse 8 is first mention of Babylon in Revelation. others are. Now, this is one of those places where I wish I had a chart to put them up for you, but I just had not the time this week. It just couldn't be done. So here they are. Write them down. They are chapter 16 and verse 19, chapter 17, verse 5, chapter 18, verse 2, chapter 18 and verse 10, and 18, verse 21. I'm sorry, 3 times in chapter 18, verses 2, 10, and 21. And Babylon is called great, or the great city, in all of those verses after we had the great city in Revelation 11:8. End quote. So I wrote all of that in the margin of my Bible. But with verse 8, make sure you get in the margin of your Bible those passages. Now, I do not have those passages in your notes. They're not in the syllabus. That's, I think, a great failure on my part. And so I maybe have to rework that. But as you can see, the page is full. Sometimes I was determined to have, all the notes on one chapter on one page and may not be able to pull it off. But make sure you get these. This Babylon the Great, this Babylon the great city, this Babylon that's fallen from the first time that it's introduced in chapter 14 and verse 8. This Babylon is Jerusalem. It is Jerusalem beyond all conceivable doubt. And I doubted it for a lot of years, and a lot of people doubt it to this day. But brethren, let's get rid of all the doubts in the book of Revelation. It's intended to be understood. Let's get rid of all this doubting, because it's a mistake and a failure on our part to still be nurturing it 2,000 years later or 20 years later. If you've been a Christian for 20 years, it's about time you figured Revelation out. So let's get this collection of verses. It's one of the most compelling and convincing ways to see that Babylon the Great is Jerusalem for sure. So I'm going to read them again for you to jot down, either in your Bible itself or a separate piece of paper, but get these notes. We have Babylon the Great in chapter 14, verse 8, 16, 19, chapter 16, verse 19, chapter 17, verse 5, and 3 places in chapter 18, verses 2, 10, and 21. And then make the note prominently next to verse 8. See, S-E-E, Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. In all these passages about Babylon, she's referred to as either great or the great city. After this was said in chapter 11 and verse 8, their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. The great city of Revelation is one city. There is only one great city in Revelation. The great city in Revelation is the city where Jesus died. That is not Rome, now is it? It's just not. It's Jerusalem. And we were told that in chapter 11, verse 8. So now we're supposed to just forget it 3 chapters later and go find some other city? There were 2 mystical names for the great city in 11:8. There is a 3rd mystical name for the rest of the book once we start in chapter 14, and that name is Babylon. Babylon, Sodom, and Egypt. These names that are so specifically associated with failure and sin and corruption and worldliness. People who do not belong to God. People who would not serve their Lord. People from the time of Abraham, with Sodom and Moses with Egypt and Babylon with David. And in each of these cases where faithful people were tormented, from Lot to the Jews in captivity, and of course Daniel. Did I say David earlier? I think I might have meant Daniel. Daniel and his friends, and all the rest of the Jews that had gone into 3 different waves of captivity that had been prophesied in more than one place in our Old Testament. And so Jerusalem now is as vile, is as corrupt, is as filthy, is as polluted, is as sinful, is as disgusting as e'er these 3 physical cities had ever been. And now she must wear their names. But the great city is the city where Jesus was crucified. There aren't 2 cities you could say that about. And there's only one great city in the book of Revelation. So you see what I mean? That things start to really come into such a focus that it's like the magnifying glass is setting the paper on fire now. You know, we have focused this light down till we know we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem because of her Babylonic degree of corruption. Now coming back to chapter 14, let's read verse 8 again. Another angel, a second one, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her fornication. Now, the very fact that it says all nations of her fornication, it derails so many people. They go, oh, well, you can't say that about Jerusalem. Rome would be guilty of that, but not Jerusalem. But brethren, you'd only say that if you're going to limit your thoughts about this influence, making all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her fornication, if you limit it to a very specific kind of a thought. Brethren, the Jews were the light of the world. I've been preaching on this or teaching on it in a Bible class on Sunday mornings just the last few weeks. I was struck in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and 5 that here some few years ago to discover there that the Jews were always the light of the world. Now, I'd known for quite a long time that in the Sermon on the Mount, the light of the world and the salt of the earth represented the Jews that Jesus was talking to on the Mount. So there weren't any Christians in the Sermon on the Mount. There were Christians on that hill. Jesus wasn't going to die for another 3 years and some months. The people, he said, were the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Their city set on a hill were the Jews. And I'd always thought, that they were never intended to be influential to the nations, because I had men that I still respect magnificently, great and good men and Bible students and scholars, who had taught me this. Well, I think they'd just been overlooking some passages, and I'd stumbled across some of these as my life went on and discovered that God had always expected his people to show the rest of the world how to live their lives. They were always seeds in the midst of this soil, hoping to bring people to the morality of a living God, to the character and virtue that God expects of all people. His people, the Jews, are only the tiniest fraction of the population of the world, every one of which was made in the image of God, every one of which was loved as much as any Jew ever was, every one of which God wanted to come to him and come to heaven. They were never cast off, God forbid. They just did not have the advantages and blessings that the Jews did. But that's not to say that they were just thrown away and forgotten. Jonah was sent to the Gentiles. Other prophets had been sent to the Gentiles. God loved the Gentiles, and he was using the Jews to teach them, to show them the better way. You start looking for that in your Old Testament particularly, and I think if you open your mind to it, it'll surprise you. You scratch your head and yell up teeth time. How could I have overlooked this? How did I never see this before? So here are these people who, the Jews, likewise corrupt and bring shame upon the name of our God when they sin and they fail him, because they are still associated with Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. They can never escape that. Yahweh is the Jewish God, not Molech, not Astarte, not any of these others. Yahweh. And when they misbehave, when they sin, when they go cavort and play, with Baal, when they do this, they bring dishonor upon the name of God. They corrupt the people around them into thinking that Yahweh is no different or better than their gods were. And so, brethren, it shouldn't surprise us that now the city where Jesus was crucified is described as fallen, not because it's yet destroyed. It hasn't been destroyed yet. This is a prophecy of an event that's shortly to come to pass. But they are fallen into sin. They are fallen into corruption. They have fallen from grace and from God's favor. They are fallen into the dust and dirt and mire and muck and vomit of the pigs and dogs. This is what they are, fallen in that sense. And fallen in the sense of not one stone going to be left on top of another on the Mount Zion, on the Temple Mount, is not far off either, because they've earned it. So in verse 9, another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast, see Beast chapter 13, and his image, set up and promoted by the earth beast, chapter 13, receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, 10, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, and he'll be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Now, I don't believe this to be eternal judgment, final judgment passage. This is your last chance. Here is your final and fullest warning. Now, I think, as I mentioned in the introductory material, why in the world should we think the 7 churches in Asia, quickly read the book and then put it in a can and buried it, in the ashes of their hearth? They copied the book, sent it everywhere. The whole Roman Empire got this book in very short order. We've got it today because it was spread in that manner. This is the last chance. The 7 letters went to those Asians and woke them up. Don't worship the beast or his image. Don't worship Rome. And then it spread throughout the Roman Empire. Don't worship the beast or his image or Rome. And the wrath of God will fall upon you if you do. Now, that wrath is going to fall upon the Jews first. It will, of course, eventually fall upon everybody. There's a final judgment. There's personal judgment. These things are all to be unfolding as the years go by. But back to the focus and the point in this one. We have a judgment coming in verse 10. He will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, and be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. Now look at this. The smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day and night. Those who worship the beast in his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. 12. Here's the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. Next to verse 12, right, Revelation 13:10, another verse I do not have for you in your syllabus, I don't think. So look at Revelation 13:10, and you'll find a very similar expression. It just leaves off the faith part. But the point is that the saints in these next 5 or so years still have to be faithful, still have to persevere, still have to keep their faith. The Great Tribulation is only going to be getting worse. They will very shortly have to flee their homes and head off, to Pella in the Peruvian wilderness, because these events are shortly to come to pass. But persevere, be faithful, don't look back, flee the city, but serve your God. Don't look back from the plow. Keep plowing that straight furrow and serve your God, which indicates that this is not a picture of final judgment. There's life to come. There's time to come. There's suffering to be had. It's not a depiction of the end of the world. It is a depiction of the fall of Jerusalem. Now then, with regard to verse 10's fire, brimstone, and tormenting, and then verse 11's smoke of the torment going up forever and ever. I do have for you a list of passages, one of which was incorrect and we fixed, there in the very center part under chapter 14, verses 9 through 12. I'm going to read from my notes now from the syllabus. This fire, brimstone, and smoke means thoroughly or permanently punished. See example below in Isaiah 34, verses 1 through 15, regarding Edom of long ago. I'm going to read all of that in a minute. But then note, you get a little bit of it. And then the last line in that segment, it says, see also Isaiah 131 and 66:24, Jeremiah 7:20 and 17:27, Ezekiel 20 verse 47, Matthew 3:12, and Jude 7. Now, I don't have time for all of those, but I very definitely want to do Isaiah. It's the longest. So everybody back now to Isaiah 34. As I've said so very many times, we've had a terrible time as a people, and the denominational churches are far worse, but even the Lord's people have done a pretty poor job for a long time with the book of Revelation. And it's just obvious that we weren't familiar enough with the Old Testament. All the clues, all the answers and explanations and interpretations really are back in chapter, or back in the Old Testament. And in this case, in chapter 34's first 15 verses. It's a lot of reading, so listen. Draw near, O nations, that's Gentiles, to hear, and listen, O peoples, that's Gentiles, as if God would forget he loved them so much. Let the earth and all it contains hear, and the world and all that springs from it, for Yahweh's indignation is against all the nations, and his wrath against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them, the armies. He has given them over to slaughter, physical death here on the earth, and past tense. So their slain will be thrown out, and their corpses will give off their stench, and the mountains will be drenched with their blood. And all the hosts of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts will also wither away as a leaf withers from the vine, as one withers from the fig tree. Well, sure it will someday. But look at 5. For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom. So, brethren, I'm not doubting that one day the end of the world will come. I've never, ever taken one step back from that. 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about that. But this passage, while it can reference something like that, is still in the context of more immediate judgment, Old Testament judgment upon Edom in verse 5, who is named again at the end of verse 6. Let's read verse 5. My sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction. The sword of Yahweh is filled with blood. It is sated with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For Yahweh has a sacrifice in Basra, chief city in Edom, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. It's limited to Edom. It's not a planetary judgment that he's discussing here. 7. Wild oxen shall also fall with them, young bulls with strong ones. Thus their land will be soaked with blood, and their dust become greasy with fat. For Yahweh has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Edom has mistreated Zion. Edom has mistreated their brethren Jews. They will pay for it, and they did a long time ago. Verse 9, here's what happened. Its streams shall be turned into pitch, its loose earth into brimstone. Its land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night or day. Its smoke shall go up forever. But please note, it doesn't mean eternally after the world is destroyed, because it's from generation to generation. We don't have any generations in heaven after the final judgment. We have eternity, not generations. No more babies being born. It shall be desolate. None shall pass through it forever and ever. Pelican and hedgehog shall possess it. Owl and raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch over it the line of desolation and the plumb line of emptiness. Its nobles, there's no one there whom they may proclaim king, and all its princes shall be nothing. Thorns shall come up in its fortified towers, nettles and thistles in its fortified cities. It shall also be a haunt of jackals and abode of ostriches, and the desert creatures shall meet with the wolves. The hairy goat also shall cry to its kind,
Yes, the night monster shall settle there and shall find herself a resting place. The tree snake shall make its nest and lay eggs there. It'll hatch and gather them under its protections. Yes, the hawk shall be gathered there, every one with its kind. Brethren, it's about the physical desolation of the nation of Edom because they mistreated the Jews, and it was long ago fulfilled. And it's a barren and desolate land to this day. And all these animals, still are living there. It's not the end of the world when you read about torment and smoke that rises up forever and ever. And one thing's for really sure. We know where Edom was and is. We know where Basra was, and there isn't any smoke that's still rising there. This is symbolic terminology well known and understood by the Jews to recognize a permanent judgment, the effects of which will never be expunged. That judgment, when it happens, is complete and permanent, and it was. But the smoke is not physically still rising. Now, in Isaiah 34:10, please write in the margin of your Bible, as I have in mine, Jude verse 7. And Revelation 19 verses 1 through 3. We will not look at Jude tonight. We'll not look at Revelation 19 tonight, but you get the point. When you come back to my notes, you can go to Isaiah 131, 66:24, Jeremiah twice, Ezekiel, and these other passages. You'll find these similar terminologies representing different physical judgments, all of which were fulfilled long ago. The prophets foretold it. Their prophecy met with a physical, real-world fulfillment, proving that the prophet was a spokesperson for God. The image is not to be taken literally when it comes to the smoke, but I think it is quite literal with the animals, and all the rest of that. And so prophetic imagery, brethren, is a wonderful thing. And it is a gross mistake, one that's been often made, and I made myself, to say that if you're reading a figurative passage, then everything about it must be figurative. So the book of Revelation is figurative, they say, so everything has to be figurative. It can't have a real world fulfillment. Fine. Then John wasn't there. Because John's in the book of Revelation, and there were no churches in Asia. It's all figurative. See, nobody believes that in practice. We know that isn't an accurate way to represent God's prophetic word. We have read Foy Wallace's book, It's a Marvel, by the same name, God's prophetic word. Brethren, you have a mixture of terminology which presents a concept that's crystal clear and understandable, parts of which do not take place in physical reality, but parts of which do. So you develop a sense of which is which. John actually lived and breathed and was on the island of Patmos. Those are not figures that don't have real world actualities. And so there's always been a mixture, and we've always treated it like it was a mixture. We've just disagreed on what is a physical reality and what isn't. Now, I do want to read another one, though, and that one will be also in Isaiah. Hopefully you're still there. I've already turned away myself. But let's look at Isaiah chapter 66 as just a big teaser. Now, this is the last chapter, and we want to be reading the last verse of the book of Revelation. We're going to come back to all this later. So again, you know how I do. I try to introduce you ideas in advance, and then they're not so unfamiliar later. You've been thinking about them. Look at the last verse in the book of Isaiah. Then they shall go forth and look on the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me. Now, if you stopped right there, would you think that was, symbolic and figurative? For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all mankind, which still exists because the earth is still turning. So when we're looking at the worm not dying and the fire not being quenched, those expressions are found elsewhere in both the Old and New Testaments. And brethren, they do not speak of an eternal torment in a place called hell. They are figures and symbols representative of actual events now past fulfilled. We'll get into all this later, but be thinking about Isaiah. And if you can find some time, brethren, start with Isaiah 49 and read all the rest of that book. We're going to have a lot of fun in Isaiah some one of these days. Maybe more than one class, as a matter of fact. We want to really look at Isaiah. So be reading Isaiah, start at 49 and go on down to the end of the book, but particularly these last chapters, because they're all over Revelation to come. Now let's wrap this up. I'm at 4 minutes to go. So let's come on back to chapter 14, and I'm going to leave it there on the fire and brimstone. This may be still, very intriguing and maybe even upsetting and distressing if I strike at some treasured notion that I once held and no longer do, and you still do. And we're going to come back to some of this later, and I may be teaching on it as a follow-up class once the Revelation is finished. I may be going into some of these things I haven't decided yet. After that, we'll keep the class going. So let's just pick up now with verse 13. I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." There's going to be people dying in the Lord from now on. And they've been doing that for nigh into 2,000 years, 1950 now. And so, brethren, not everything in the book of Revelation has to be fulfilled with the fall of Jerusalem in September of 70 AD. Get used to it. 14. I looked, finish 13. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. As it turns out, a week ago last Saturday, I sat 6 feet away from a guy who had COVID-19. I got a call later. Hey, he tested positive, on Tuesday. And so you might want to think about that. And I've been self-quarantining, never did get sick, so I feel fine. But my point is, I went to a memorial. Why? Because we wanted to commemorate one who had died in the Lord. One who fits what it says in verse 13. A woman who has rested from her labors. Her deeds follow with her. This is not a passage that stopped happening back in 70 AD. It's still going on. Revelation has things that are past, things that are present, and things that are future. We just have to be more capable Bible students who know the difference between each of them. Now we come to the judgment itself. That is the near and shortly to come to pass thing in verse 14. I looked and behold a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. I take to be Jesus. Another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe." Why? Because Babylon has fallen. So now it's time for the reaping. 16. He sat on the cloud, swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven. He also had a sharp sickle. So here's John looking at all these angels and what I think certainly has to be Jesus, and then the sickles and the reaping. What a scene this must have been. Another angel in verse 18. One who has power over fire. Now you might want to make a note. I believe this is the angel of chapter 8. And down here in verse 4, the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and he filled it with the fire of the altar and threw it to the earth. And there followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. This is the answer to the prayers of the martyred souls under the altar in chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Most of this book is the answer to that prayer. Their cry for vengeance for their blood is being answered in Revelation 14 by Jesus, by the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world and wears the crown of triumph and rides that white horse, and we'll see him again in chapter 19. So in verse 18, another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar. He called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, "Put in your sharp sickle, gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle to the earth, gathered the vine of the earth, threw him into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city. Blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. You don't serve Jesus, and you will be slaughtered. Fallen is the great city. Take the filth out of that once beautiful city and pure city and tread it down. Those people in the great winepress of the wrath of God. But this is all, brethren, very closely, directly, absolutely centralized in the city of Jerusalem, in taking its defilements and impurities outside to be trodden in the winepress, and the blood comes out for 200 miles. That is, a fact that the length north to south of Israel's promised land is about 200 miles, so it's something in that vicinity. This is an image of limitless bloodshed, of, bloodshed just unspeakable and unimaginable. But I don't believe it's ever going to happen physically in the sense of being 4 feet deep for 200 miles. Well, how wide is it? We're not even told, And so John sees that image. What does that image represent? Death. Slaughter and death. The part of it that I think we should not take literally is up to the horses' bridles for 200 miles and spread out unspecified. But that such destruction as might be described by the horrified onlooker in this manner was described in a similar manner by Josephus. Read about paragraphs he spends talking about the bloodshed in the fall of Jerusalem. So, brother, where I am is this. I will show you one milestone after another, particularly about this Babylon, each week to come. And as we do in this fallen Babylon, who's being so summarily destroyed, we will see every time this close association with Jerusalem in the first century, because she rejected the Messiah and corrupted everybody, in her fornication with the world. She was a harlot and a whore. She was not true and faithful to her husband, God in heaven. She then consorted in all her sins like the rest of the world and with the world, and was renowned for it. Now she's being destroyed. This is the main theme of the book of Revelation. It is the primary theme of the chapters that are to follow. Be reading these passages to come, and especially the list of verses that I've already given you. The quote I'll leave to you as we close the class at the very bottom of my syllabus from 3 different places in Wars of the Jews, Book 6, chapters 4, 5, and 8. And then the paragraph numbers are given in each of those references. So look them up online. There's several places you can do instant referencing to Josephus for free online, number of different websites. Read the rest of the story and see if it doesn't lead you to think that what actually happened very literally and physically, materially in the time and space in Jerusalem of the first century might aptly be described under the symbol of blood 4 feet deep for 200 miles. That slaughter was that full. I'll leave you with all of that. Look forward to next week's lessons. Love you all so much. I hope it'll be a beautiful day in your neighborhood every day this week to come, as it's supposed to be according to my weatherman. Have a good one.